Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome once again to the Barts 900 series, really gaining momentum now, the fourth in our series. We hope you've enjoyed the lectures so far. I certainly have. Immensely entertaining and informative. As you know, if you've joined us on previous occasions, you'll realize that we're offering these webinars free of charge, but nevertheless, we do welcome your donations. They add to the whole purpose of what we're trying to do here to generate funds and interest in the restoration of the North Wing at Barts. Donations couldn't be easier to do. You just go to the Barts Heritage website, click on the yellow button, which is available on all the pages on that site, and it even gives you the opportunity to go for gift aid if you qualify for that. So do please click on that button and your donations will be very welcome. So our guest tonight is Claire Cogar. Very well-known archaeologist. I'm going to be telling you a little bit about her biography shortly, but first a word on what's going to happen over the next 45 minutes. Claire and I are going to have a chat. She's going to give a presentation on her work excavating the site at part of Barts, and then we're going to take any questions that pop up. We've already had a couple that have come in before the show began, so we're going to have a lot to talk about. And then we're going to wrap up at the end well before 45 minutes expired. So as I say, Claire is our guest. She's a double graduate of both Portsmouth and Bristol universities, and since then has held a number of senior positions. She's currently Director of Archaeology at the Iceni project, where her main work is involved in excavating the old Middlesex Hospital, which many of you will know. And I dare say that one or two of you might have actually have worked there during its existence, but sadly no longer. And that is where Claire is currently focused. But during a previous role as a senior project manager for the Museum of London Archaeology, she was very much involved with excavating parts of Barts, which is the site that we're all very familiar with. So Claire, welcome to the Barts 900 series.
Hi, hello, thank you, Robert. Yeah, very excited. Thank you very much for the invite.
Well, we're certainly looking forward to all that you've got to say, because I was going to say we're digging deep into the Barts site, and the pun is entirely intended. So we're very much looking forward to your presentation. So over to you.
Great. Thank you very much. For me, like for many people, Barts has a special place in my heart as a very iconic part of London that I have a very strong working connection to. So it's a pleasure to be able to speak to the people who work there day to day or have retired, subsequently retired, making Barts Hospital what it is, you know, internationally renowned. Okay, I will just share my screen with you. Okay, can you see that, Robert?
I certainly can.
Great. Okay, so I am going to talk to you a bit about developer-led archaeology in London, how that works within the planning process, and of course talk about our favourite hospital, the one we all know and love. Fantastic historic picture of King Henry VIII Gate there. Okay, so I thought it would be useful to outline some of the previous archaeological investigations on the site and the location of those. So many of you know, development at Barts has been ongoing for more than 15 years. Down in the southeast corner here, phase 1, phase 2 and phase 2A were all undertaken prior to me being involved in the project. And what I've done is highlighted some of the key sites I've worked on here. There's the phase 3, currently car park, and the revised former RSQ residential staff quarters building. That was our phase 3, that was our first really big excavation. Then there's the Barts Pathology building here with the yellow band around it, which the former RSQ actually became part of that site as well. we've got the St Barts the Less church up here, not quite so famous as its big brother, St Barts the Great. We did a little bit of work out in the courtyard area there. Obviously, the infamous North Wings highlighted here in the Maggie Centre. And the courtyard area in the centre. So as you can see, a very big site subject to an EIA. That's an environment impact assessment, a process that very large developments go through when they go through planning. And there have been multiple phases of work, and even, as I mentioned, the residential staff quarters has been actually excavated twice. Now, I'm sure probably a question that springs to mind is, how could you excavate a site twice? Well, when we were undertaking phase 3, we only dug part of the site impacted by the new building, whereas when Nuffield Health came along to develop the pathology sites, their basement slab was much deeper than the original one, so we had to go back and excavate again.
I wonder if I could pop in here, because a number of the people watching tonight will be not that familiar with the way in which the hospital has been completely redeveloped over the last 20 odd years. So to help people get orientated, I'm assuming that phase 1, as shown on your map, largely coincides with the old Queen Mary's nursing home, which was demolished on Little Britain to make way for the new hospital. And then phase 2 and phase 2A, they were the subsequent phases which allowed then the complete redevelopment of the hospital right across that site. Would that be correct?
Yeah. My favourite parts are obviously from phase 3 onwards, because that's when I joined. But yes, that's helpful context, Robert.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay. So after the pathology site came, actually before the pathology site, the Maggie Centre, what was developed at the end of the North Wing. So within this red line boundary, you can see around the outside here, nearly all of the Barts site has been developed and excavated at various points in the last 15 years. So I thought it'd be useful. A lot of people ask me, where do you get the money to do your digs from? Who pays for the work? Well, the type of work I do is development-led archaeology. It's funded by the developer of a site. It is undertaken because it's a requirement of planning. So commercial/development-led archaeology is part of the planning process. And the very first stage we undertake is an archaeological desktop study or heritage statement in support of a planning application. And a site can also be subject to an EIA, an environment impact assessment. It's a large development like Barts with the potential to have significant impacts on the surrounding setting. So what a desktop study does is it looks at the potential archaeology on site. It doesn't do any intrusive work, but it's a very high level early stage review of what could be there. And then if all goes well, you get your planning consent and you get a condition for archaeological work attached to consent. So a developer is required to undertake the works set by the local authority to fulfill that condition. And then eventually the condition is discharged and you've got your new buildings. So the second stage I'm going to talk about is test trenching. I'm sure some people watching will have seen Time Team and are familiar with the concept of test trenches. Test trenches look to see, they use that desk-based research and they look to see actually if there is anything in the ground, presence or absence of archaeology. And if, depending on your opinion, if you get lucky or unlucky, and there's lots of archaeology in your test trenches, You then move to an excavation design phase on a big site like this. So when you're digging deep underground, several meters, you can't just dig a hole in the basement of a building or outside without some structural support. So again, we have to work with engineers and developers to ensure that our excavation is safe and structurally supported. Then there's a phase called mitigation. So if you've heard mitigation referred to in relation to archaeology before, commercial archaeology is the mitigation of the development impact. So we only excavate what will be disturbed by the new building. And mitigation can be the form of an excavation, a team of archaeologists like that worked on the different sites here, or a watching brief, which some of you may have heard of as well, which is just an archaeologist watching a contractor's groundworks. So it's a much less intrusive form of archaeology, but the results are much more limited as well. After this, you get a post-excavation assessment report that looks at your results and sets that within the MPPF requirements for heritage and archaeology work, and determines what's interesting about the site and what isn't so interesting within bigger picture sort of research questions in terms of archaeology in London. Then you get your analysis, publication and engagement. Still a requirement of the planning condition to do this. So analysis is specialist study of what you found. Publication can be a journal article, a study series, a TV programme, and that's often tied in with public engagement. Now the final phase, and I'll talk about this in a bit more detail later, is archiving and reburial. So what happens to the finds when all the work's finished? Well, they go to the archive, and what happens to human remains when they've been excavated? Well, they go for reburial. It's worth me flagging up actually that I'm going to show some pictures of skeletons being excavated shortly. If anybody isn't comfortable with that, we understand, and you're very welcome to log off. So after you've undertaken all those things, then you've got your condition discharge. So you've fulfilled your requirements for archaeological work. So these are exactly the stages we went through at St Barts for the different sites with varying results. So just take a look at the desktop study, why we do what we do, what sources we use. So on the left here, you can see Braun and Hogenberg's map of 1572, where I've circled the location of the St Barts site. Now, I'm sure no one will be surprised to hear that the very old maps like this are not very accurate. As you can see, it's much more of a sketch than an accurate record. But during this period, people are becoming very interested in cartographic recording, and very interesting. It gives you a first sort of early taste and look at what might be on site. And you've also, if you look up here, it's got Smithfield or Smitefield, as it was back in the day, and St Bartholomew's and Long Lane. And in the centre here, we've got a much later Ordnance Survey map from 1892 that shows the development of the hospital, and on the right, an insurance map. So, yeah, first port of call are historic maps. Now, they give you a steer, but again, often many of the buildings no longer survive, obviously because we've got modern buildings and structures on site. Or you've got, for example, early medieval buildings like this are disturbed by later post-medieval buildings that are still archaeology, that are depicted on the later Ordnance Survey map, but again, they've disturbed the earlier medieval archaeology. So this desktop study is required in support of planning. And what it also does is look at contemporary impacts on site, how deep the current basement is on site, what are the modern uses, is the ground contaminated, is there an unexploded ordnance risk on the site, so unexploded bombs from World War II. And what it does is it draws together all that information with regards to the proposed development and looks at what impact the proposed development will have on any surviving archaeology on site. And obviously, it doesn't know exactly what's surviving on site, but it uses these cartographic sources and other records to make an informed guess. This also allows the local authority to make a decision on the potential archaeological work required after planning. This is one of my favourite maps on the left here, the Ogilby and Morgan 1676. This is particularly special as we've got the greater Barts red line planning boundary around the edge here. We've got the pathology site in green here, and we've actually got the conjectured Ogilby and Morgan line of the Great Fire of London in orange here. Now, on the right here, you've got a painting depicting this significant historic event. It was, you know, it affected every Londoner at the time. And what's so exciting about the Ogilby and Morgan map of this section of Barts Hospital, you've got Giltspur Street here, so your former residential staff quarters here, is that we actually found evidence of very intense burning all along here, where, you know, the end of the Great Fire is marked. It stopped at Pie Corner here. Now, quite regularly, historic maps don't provide a very accurate steer on what's actually there. They give you an indication, but this was incredibly exciting, and you can see archaeologists in the corner there working on intense, you know, material that's been in very black, intense heat, burning. So that was absolutely incredible to find. And when you walk through the basements there, when we were excavating this, you could just smell the fire still. It was like nothing else. It was a very special moment as an archaeologist.
How far below ground level would you have to go to find that sort of direct evidence of the Great Fire?
It depends from site to site. So again, we were digging to the depth of the impact of the new build. So you have these late post-medieval cellars and basements fronting onto Giltspur Street. We found the remains of those. So those were 17th century structures that were burnt and partially destroyed during the Great Fire. They were then levelled over and new buildings built on top of them, and that process continued. So here they were about 1.5 meters down, but it really does vary depending on how much demolition and construction has been in a particular area. Okay, test trenching. So I mentioned earlier, test trenching determines the presence or absence of archaeology. So we target our test trenches based on the impact of the proposed development in areas where construction will commence, and we're also quite sure from the desktop work that there is some potential for survival. So what you don't do is you don't put your test trenches up against walls in basements, because you'll pick up just the construction cut of that wall in all likelihood. So we like to get them in big open areas, and what we do is we excavate them fully down the archaeological sequence, so that we can see what level the natural ground is at and what type of archaeology will be impacted by the development. So what happened at Barts in the OPD, some very interesting archaeology. We had Roman burials We had evidence of Roman buildings, medieval buildings. We didn't pick up the Great Fire evidence in our test trenching, but you only test trench part of the site. So that's the gamble you always take in archaeology, in that you could miss the good stuff, or you could just have all of the complex archaeology in your test trenches. So again, it's always a challenge. It's generally a 5% sample of the impact area. So again, I'm talking a lot about mitigation, impact, development. This is all tied into why we do what we do. We are there to ensure anything that will be impacted by development is preserved by record. So on the right there, you can see some very large evaluation trenches there being excavated with the machine to get us through the archaeological sequence.
And is that at Barts?
This is actually from Middlesex Annex.
Okay.
So it's at St Bart's, the evaluation at the OPD. We were in the basement. It was very dark and dingy whilst the building was still operational to the best of our knowledge. So lots of concrete, very dark. Again, we had to limit our times when we were breaking or doing machine work to avoid disturbing people above. Many of you may remember these works ongoing, which were perhaps noisy and disturbing to what you were trying to do. The whole archaeological team were very mindful of trying to do the right thing by the live working hospital, but you know, it's difficult, it's challenging. That's why we like it. So in your test trenches, you find several meters of archaeology, then you're in a bit of a predicament, because you building on site and you need to construction.
Hang on a minute, Claire. I think we are running into one or two second problems. Perhaps you could say that again.
No problem. So your test trenches have found 2 to 3 meters of archaeology on site, for example. The building has to be built. How are you going to get that archaeology out? So you go through a period of excavation design as an archaeologist when you're working with engineers, developers, your builders, Skanska in the instance of Barts, where you come up with a temporary works design to support your deep excavation. So this drawing on the left here is a temporary works design. It's a king post wall, and we had several of these at Barts. On the right here, it might not look like it, but we're actually 3 meters down. There we are stood in the base of that excavation. On the left, you've got how these temporary works are designed by an engineer, and on the right there you've got the actual physical implementation of them. Now, as you can see, you've got wooden struts across there which make it challenging to dig in between, but yeah, some of that, as you were alluding to earlier, Robert, some of that material can be extremely deep. Again, more excavation designs. Behind John and I there, we've got the king post wall that is supporting our 2 meter dig down here. Again, it also has to brace the load of the material that the machine is stood on. We're digging all this out. We're effectively structurally undermining the area. We use all sorts of plans to locate our trenches and enabling works. Here on the right, you've got the line of the king post walls at the design phase. You've got your test trenches. Now, these lines, we worked with the engineers to ensure that they went to areas of low grade archaeology to avoid impacting anything significant. So your excavation design phase can be 6 months or more sometimes. It's it's more a civil engineering led process, and the challenges surrounding that, which obviously we're not engineers, but we have to work with the engineers to get where we need to be. So yeah, again, this is excavation in practice. This is what commercial archaeologists do. It's the monitoring of breaking out of concrete of modern buildings, and then the machine stripped down to the top of archaeology. At some Barts, as I said, we found structural remains dating to the 17th, 18th, 19th century, post-medieval cellars, basements. We found earlier medieval chalk buildings, and prior to that we had Roman clay and timber buildings. So Barts has over 2,000 years of history beneath its wings, metaphorically speaking, now that we've dug it out. On the right, you can see an archaeologist using a level, which is what we use to record the depth of different deposits across the site. Everything we dig, we make a paper record of, so it can be reconstructed and written up once we're off site. So again, here we are excavating human remains. At Barts, we had nearly 30 Roman burials. Barts was in the area of the Western Roman cemetery, but the extent of it wasn't well known. The Romans forbid burying within the city walls, so you get defined cemeteries outside of the Roman city walls, but Barts is clearly far enough out. But what's quite interesting is we found a range of Roman buildings under what the function was this far out. Really, it's quite unusual. So archaeologists
talking about the human burials that you found, you've mentioned the Roman ones. What sort of historical span did the human remains cover? Because we've had one question come in suggesting that there was a story, at least, that there were plague victims that were buried somewhere between the east and west wings at Barts, and that was one reason why there were no tunnels built in that area. Are you able to confirm or deny that in any way?
We didn't find any evidence of plague victims in any of the areas we'd excavated at Barts, but evidently we haven't excavated everything. So, you know, who knows? But the skeletons on site at Barts were Roman.
Thank you.
Skeletons are excavated by hand. As you can see, archaeologists there brushing away the dirt to expose the extent of them. They're then surveyed, photographed, lifted. So prior to 1990, archaeology was not part of the planning process. There was no requirement to do archaeological work, and things like this happened on a regular basis. So this poor skeleton has been very disturbed by a pile. Well, it really sort of evokes why what we do is important. This is what we want to prevent. Whilst we work in development and we very much want to support the developments we work on, particularly the public sector ones we do, but also we want to stop things like this happening because this is our cultural heritage. So again, doing the work we were doing at Barts, as disturbing as it may have been to some, this is what we're preventing. So after we've done all our digging, 50% of an archaeologist's work is in the field. The other 50% is offsite. It's writing your report on the results of your findings. This is something we use, for example, to track the extent of grave cuts on a site, the location of them. And we also use this when we're digging to track. The green ones are the finished ones, the orange ones are ongoing ones. So you're constantly working towards, you know, your end date, your dig end date. I'm delighted to say all the work at Barts hospital finished on time, all the archaeological work, which we were very proud of. So this assessment report.
How long are you given, Claire? Because of course, no doubt the developers are eager to get stuck in to rebuild the entire site. So you've got a very tight time frame there, haven't you?
You do. I mean, the RSQ and the OPD, we had 4 weeks, which, given the extent of archaeology we found in our test trenches, was not enough. But given that it's a public sector development, we knew we had to make it work. So we double shifted. We had 2 shifts of archaeologists from 7 a.m. till 11 p.m. at night, 7 days a week for 4 weeks. Yeah, it was exhausting, but worth it. Yeah, this is the bigger picture information. We're looking not just at single skeletons or grave cuts here, we're looking at a bigger picture of how they interrelate with one another. And this assessment report quite critically looks at what's interesting. Developers aren't expected to pay for everything that's excavated on a site. We can't look at everything, there's too much material. There was hundreds of kilos of pottery from Barts. What we do is we focus our further study to discharge the planning condition on what is meaningful and can contribute to our understanding of London archaeology. So you've got your analysis, publication and engagement stage. This is the stage where anything in the report that's been flagged up as very specialist interest is really contributing to our understanding of Roman archaeology in London, for example. And this is when you get your specialists like Bone Lady here, looking at the really highly significant material and doing very intricate specialist work for publication, either in a journal article, in a book. We're looking at other mediums these days of sharing the results, because technical volumes are not very reachable to a big audience who actually want to share our results more widely with people. So yeah. So people always ask me, what happens to the remains when you finish? Well, any pottery or all the are archived with the Museum of London at the very end of the process. Specialists have done their thing. Anything that's unstable, like leather, is treated by a conservator, and they all go into, they're all boxed carefully for anybody to come in and look at, study if they so wish. Human remains and skeletons, well, that's a little bit different. They were all Roman at St. Bart's, and that sort of number is quite small, between 20 and 30. So they will probably be retained for specialist study at the museum. But on other sites, like the Middlesex Hospital Annex that we're working on, they're all 18th and 19th century burials, and there are hundreds and hundreds of them, and there's no way to, the museum is filling up fast. So they will, excluding specialist cases, they will go for reburial in consecrated ground. But any with specialist diseases or injuries may be kept for the teaching collection and further study. So there you go, a short, sharp summary of how commercial archaeology worked at Barts and some of our fantastic results.
Thank you, Claire. Well, it was short and sharp. And doesn't that to some extent mirror your activity as an archaeologist? Because you've got to get in there very quick. You've got a very limited time period in which to do your work, and then you're coming out again. So you're coming in after the story has begun and you're getting out before the story is finished. Isn't that in some way a little unsatisfactory? What I get to do and get paid to do is a real privilege. Excavating particularly the remains of Romans who lived in Londinium nearly 2,000 years ago is a privilege.
It's always difficult to strike the right balance, and that is the role of your archaeological project manager or director, doing the right thing by the cultural material and the human remains, which is legally regulated, but also, you know, particularly when you're working on a public sector development, we are so mindful that these are facilities for living people that need support. So striking the right balance is what makes the job really challenging, really hard, but also incredibly satisfying when you do finish on time.
Yep. Okay. Fair enough. Now we've had another question come in from one of our listeners in Canada. Believe it or not.
Wow.
He was a medical student at Barts so long ago. It was even before me, and he used to make use of the gun range below the old outpatients department.
Rifle range. Yes, I know it.
And he wants to know if you found any of his old cartridges lying on the floor there.
We did know it was a rifle range. The wall was still scarred, and right below we did a big trench in the rifle range, and that's where many of the Roman burials were, Roman buildings. So I bet you didn't know that you were stood over 2,000 years of history.
I think that's fair enough to say. Yes, he says it was one of his treats to go down there and fire off 20 rounds. But as you rightly said, he never in a moment thought that there were Roman burials immediately beneath his feet. Okay, if you like to unshare your screen, let's move on to the here and now then, shall we? Because of course we're all talking about the restoration of the North Wing, including the Great Hall. And of course, we don't know how things might pan out, but were you to be the archaeologist in having an input into this project, how might an archaeologist approach a project? Because plainly, you're not going to make any great excavations or start digging through the foundations of an existing building. How do you take it?
Well, I think it's all about contributing to context and our understanding of this building as part of the greater fabric of the Barts story. Now, you know, buildings are still archaeology, I would argue. Not everything is below ground. So your archaeologist has an awful lot to contribute to the understanding and the place of this fantastic build and its interior within the Barts story. So again, Barts has this fantastic archive. Some of you may be aware, with lots of historical records and sources, many of which we consulted during our time digging at Barts and that have contributed to the forthcoming publication. But yeah, the North Wing is the next part of the story. It's very exciting. Okay,
excellent. We've had another question come in, and I'm just trying to access it on my system. Somebody has said, will you be able to produce a plan of the medieval hospital? Well, I suspect to some extent those plans already exist, although you may not have shown them on this occasion.
Yeah, I mean, there's varying records in the archive at Barts itself, but a plan of what physically survived of the medieval hospital at Barts is more difficult. There were some medieval walls surviving, but they were very much disturbed by later walls. You see this in archaeology and the history of development of a site, in that you've got your building and then it falls into disuse and then it's leveled and then another building on top, many times on the same alignment. So there certainly are some fantastic sources. You know, if you're interested in the mapped original extent, Barts Archive is the place to go if you can get to it.
Well, I know that right now that's not possible, but surely in the fullness of time, hopefully it will be. Now we've got somebody with a particularly specialist interest, because believe it or not, they're researching what they describe as a small late 17th century building in the southwest corner of the main quad. So that might coincide with phase 2B or phase 3. Are you picturing it southwest?
Sure.
And she wondered whether you found any evidence of a freestanding rectangular building in that area.
So if I'm looking at the correct place, along Giltspur Street in the southwest corner, we found several remains of cellars and basements there dating to the 17th century.
No, I think she's talking of the main square, what you described as the courtyard on your plan.
Okay. Well, that was one of the areas of most limited work, actually. So we were undertaking a watching brief, so just watching Skanska's levelling there because their excavations were so minimal. So we didn't see the remains of a freestanding structure, but that doesn't mean it's not there. Okay,
fair enough. Right, I think we're going to have to wrap it up. We've run right out of time, but it was absolutely fascinating, Claire. We'll come back to you for a final word in just a moment. But I want to give everybody a heads up of the treats we have in store for the remainder of the year, because we've been very busy planning our program ahead so that on the last Wednesday of October, we can welcome Liz Smith, one of my fellow trustees on Barts Heritage, and her specialty is architectural conservation. So obviously a specialist interest in the North Wing redevelopment. And then in November, now I know I've been promising you a specialist speaker on James Gibbs for a few months now. It is coming to fruition, and we'll be delighted to welcome William Aslett, who's one of the foremost academics on the subject of James Gibbs, and he'll be our speaker for the last Wednesday in November. So Claire, perhaps a final word from you, and I do know that one or two people would love to get in touch with you and to talk about your work, not only at Barts, but elsewhere. What's the best means by which they can get in touch with you?
Email is probably the best way. ccogar@iceniprojects.com, ICENI projects with an S on the end.com. But yeah, no, this is, you can probably tell, I love my job, and I absolutely love talking to other people who are interested in history and archaeology. So it's been an absolute pleasure, and thank you so very much for inviting me to speak this eve.
Well, thank you, Claire. Certainly your enthusiasm and interest absolutely shine through. So fingers crossed we'll be working with you a lot more as the project develops. So thank you, Claire. Thank you to everybody for your attendance. Once again, a big audience, a couple of hundred people right around the world have been tuning in tonight. And as ever, we'll be putting up the recording of this on our own YouTube channel, where you can also see the 3 earlier webinars if you missed them, or if you want to watch them again. So for tonight, it's a good night from me and Claire, and see you all again very soon. Bye-bye for now.
Bye-bye.